Hey guys, first video of 2023. Really excited? So let's start a new series. I haven't thought much about this series, what I'll be doing, but yeah, this is something random that I'll be start creating, and this is going to be for people like me who are having a little bit of experience in Java, and maybe somebody who is having experience in Java. And also this series can be used by people who are new to Java as well, who are learning Java right now. So basically the purpose of this series is going to be, when we start coding in our regular day-to-day job, we start forgetting the basics, right? So we gonna be brushing off our concepts, the Java concepts. And because we always focus on all the advanced stuff like Spring Boot, microservices, different tools, architecture, and all these things, and we usually forget the basics. So this series is going to be pretty random. I'll start gathering questions from here and there, which are basically asked in interviews, and we'll start learning about it. Let's see how it goes. So what we'll be naming this series as? Java Brush Up? Java Brush Up. Yeah, let's go with this. Java Brush Up. What does it mean? I really don't know. But let's start with a question. I thought about a question which straight came into my mind. The question is about interfaces in Java. So let's start about a question which is basically belongs to interface concepts in Java, and which is basically asked mostly in your interviews as well. So in our series, in this series, which is going to be called a Java Brush Up Java. Something we're going to be calling that. I'll decide the series name after I shoot this video. But yes, let's talk about a question. The question is going to be, why do we need interfaces when we already have abstract classes? This question seems very simple, but is related to different concepts of interfaces like multiple inheritance, Java diamond problem. We have also default methods which came in Java 8, and in Java 9 there are a lot of new features like static methods. We have private methods in interfaces. There are a lot of concepts, a lot of questions can be asked as counter when we start to ask these questions to a candidate called, okay, tell me, we have abstract classes, right? And what do you mean by abstract class? Abstract class is something which is going to have some abstract methods inside it, and also the abstract classes can also contain like the concrete method. So in your interface, you are also going to have abstract methods inside it, and the abstract classes also can have all the abstract methods right there. So why do you think Java people came up with a concept called interfaces? Why do you need that kind of a thing? Why do we need interfaces? Because we can do the similar things in abstract class. Well, that's a valid question. Let's explore and let's try to understand a couple of things here. Why do we need interfaces in Java when we already have abstract classes? And what is multiple inheritance? And what are different catches that we have with respect to multiple inheritance, and lot of things we'll be discussing about this concept. So let's get started. Okay, that's it for the intro. So let's start. I have a project here called inheritance, and basically we'll talk about multiple inheritances. So I have named this particular package as inheritance. So for an example, in the source folder right now, I have a package called com.selenium express, and right here I'll be creating a new class. Let's name this class as taste. Let's say it's a taste class. Let me zoom this class out a little bit like this. And right here, now let's think that this class is having a main method like this. Okay, and now we have couple of classes. Let's say this can be normal classes or abstract classes. So as we are going to compare the abstract classes and the interface, let's make it like a abstract class. So I can say abstract class, and let me create a class called taste1, and let me also create another abstract class called taste2. Okay, right here. Okay, so now imagine this is a class called taste2. Now imagine you have a method here called public void m1, and now this method is a abstract method like this, public void m1, and obviously I have to make this as abstract, and also I can copy this and paste it over here, the same method that I have m1 in both of my classes, taste1 and taste2. Now the thing is that now the question is, right now we have a couple of classes. If I want to inherit the property of taste1 or taste2 in the taste class right here, then how can I do it? It's very simple. Now taste class want to inherit, or it want to borrow the property of taste1. That now the property of taste1 is going to be m1. Taste1 is having a method called m1. Now if I want to borrow that method, it's going to be very simple. I can say taste extends taste1, and this is how I can borrow the feature of taste1 class m1 method right over here inside the taste class. So it is saying that, well, you have an abstract class which doesn't have any implementation for m1, so you have to override it. So I can just straight away go for overriding this particular method, and I can override this m1, and I can give an implementation right here called sysout inside m1 method of taste class, right? Something like this. Okay, so I have overridden the m1 method, which is coming from taste1 class, which is abstract. This method I'm overriding here, and right now I can simply do like, new taste, which is my taste class over here, and I call this m1 method that I have just given implementation, and there you go, I'm done. If I'll run this, right click, run as Java application, I can see the result over here inside m1 method of taste class. So the taste class is having the m1 method, which it is overriding from the taste1 class, because the taste1 class is a abstract class and it has a m1 method which is abstract, and that's what I'm overriding here in this class called taste, and I'm calling this. Not a problem, working like a charm. So now the problem here is, let's say for example the taste2 is having a method right now. Let's say this is not m1, this is called m2. Now let's say I want to do what? I want to basically use this taste2 class right over here inside this class, right? So I want to use the feature of taste2 class, which is an abstract class, right here inside this taste class, right? I want to borrow the feature of taste2, which is m2. So how can I borrow it? If I want to borrow the feature of taste2, which is a class, if I want to borrow the feature of that, then I have to use inheritance. And how can I use inheritance? Obviously, I need to again extend to that, right? So how can I extend? I can just do taste2 right over here. I can just do a comma, and I can try grabbing the feature of taste2. But this is right now going to give me a problem here, isn't it? Why this problem is coming? Because this is like I am trying to grab the feature of taste1 and taste2 all together in a single class called taste right here. You can see that taste extends taste1 and taste2. So I'm trying to inheriting the property from taste1 and also from taste2, which is not possible because Java does not support multiple inheritance. Well, I'm inheriting from multiple classes, so it's basically multiple inheritance which doesn't support or which is not supported by Java. And that's why we will going into the interfaces in order to overcome this particular problem. Well, there is a problem when I say that is in order to overcome the multiple inheritance problem that we are having over here, we will go to the interface in order to avoid this particular problem or in order to achieve multiple inheritance. Now these sentences are problematic, guys. Some people say, okay, what you are trying to do here, the class taste is trying to extend test1 and test2 and grab the feature of test1 and test2 and want to give it an implementation. But let's say if I want to override the M2 method right here, like I override an M1, if I want to override M2, for an example like this, Control C, and if I want to override the feature of M2 or the method of M2, and let's say if I write like this is going to be a compilation problem, because M2 method I cannot override. I can override if I remove the test1, but together test1 and test2 I cannot override, because that's basically multiple classes, and one class cannot exchange to multiple classes, because that's the problem. That's where the problem lies, and Java has not been designed like that. Now, when we talk about multiple inheritance, guys, in Java, like people say is like, okay, this is a problem. Well, this is not a problem. This is how Java has been designed. That it does not support multiple inheritance, right? There is a reason why it doesn't support multiple inheritance, because C++ supports multiple inheritance. There are some other programming languages which supports multiple inheritance, but Java does not support. Why? Well, we'll go into that. All right, so now let's understand a problem called a diamond problem in Java. So this diamond problem is related to multiple inheritance. So as I said you guys already, so what do you mean by multiple inheritance? Multiple inheritance means a class is basically borrowing properties from multiple classes, right? So one class is extending to multiple classes and trying to inherit the properties from multiple classes, and in that kind of a situation there is a probability that you are going to end up with having a problem of multiple inheritance, which is not supported by Java. And this kind of a problem basically generates something called a diamond kind of a pattern. That's why we also call it a diamond problem. So let's see that how it looks like. You can see like we have an abstract class called P or parent, and you can think like this can be an abstract class or a normal class, but I made it abstract because we have a method here called M1 which does not have anybody. Now then we have a class here called S1, which is basically a subclass 1 which extends to this P, which is our parent. So this subclass 1 extends to parent, and it's basically overriding the M1 that we have over here. Now you can see in this side we have another class called subclass 2. Now it's again extending to the parent, which is our abstract class, overriding this M1 method right here and giving it a body. Okay, now here is the problem. Imagine we have a child class, and this is basically extending to our S1 class and our S2 class. So our child class right now extends to S1 and S2, this class and this class, right? And now if our child is extending to S1 and S2 together, then this M1 and this M1 is going to be inherited inside this class. Now the problem will be inside the child class. Imagine if we have a main method, and inside that method we're accessing like child C is equal to new child, and we're trying to access c.m1 method. So child is right now is having the m1 method by default. Imagine m1 is the method that it is getting for free from its parent classes like S1 and S2, but now the problem is both the S1 class and the S2 class is having the M1 method. Now whenever the child class will do c.m1, now the child class is confused, the compiler is confused like which M1 method to call. Is this M1 method is going to be inherited from S1, or is this M1 method is going to be inherited from S2? Why? Because child class is right now extending to subclass 1 and subclass 2, which is this one and this one. Now this, if you're going to see this is like a diamond, right? Like this is like a diamond, isn't it? So that's why we call it a diamond problem. Okay, my diamond is in very bad in shape. I think you can understand this looks like a diamond. So this is kind of a problem, and basically my child class is inheriting from multiple classes, which is called as a multiple inheritance, and this program will not compile in Java, and your compiler will be simply giving you an ambiguous problem. And how to fix this up? So this inheritance problem that we are having with classes, we can resolve it using interfaces. So let's see the beauty of interfaces, and this is one of the reason out of many that we are going to have interfaces in Java, because to solve this kind of a problem. And this is not a problem, this is how Java has been designed, as I said. So this is something that we need to appreciate, that Java people stopped us from a deadly problem like this. And they have given us another way using interface what we can achieve the similar thing that we're trying to achieve over here. Okay, so let's explore that out, like how we can do this stuff using interfaces and using different techniques. Let's explore that out. Let's talk about how we will solve this particular problem. Okay, so right now it is giving me a problem in the M1 method, because obviously I can just write test1 comma test2, and this is not going to be possible. Test1 comma test2, and obviously this is not going to be possible because these are a couple of classes. So what I'll do, I'll convert these classes to interfaces. So interface test1 and interface test2. Interface test2. Okay, now test1 is having a M1 method, test2 is having a M2 method. Now if I'll come over here, if I want to use the feature of test1 and test2 all together, then as right now these are interfaces, no longer classes. So what I can do, I can just write here implements. Okay, now implements test1 and test2, and see, my error is gone. And now I can override the M1 and M2. And if I want to call M1 and M2, I can keep calling that like this, new test and dot M2 in my main method, right? So I have overridden the M1 and M2, which are abstract method of test1 and test2 interfaces. I have my test class is right now implements test1 and test2. And now I'm basically calling this method, the method that I'm overriding, and this is going to work like a charm. And right now I can see that I'll be having the output in my console. Inside M1 method of test class, inside M2 method of test class, things are working good. So like the things are clear, right? So my test class is right now implementing couple of interfaces possible, right? So one class can implement couple of interfaces, but one class cannot extend to couple of classes together. One class only can extend to one class, but one class can extend to multiple interfaces, right? So people say using inheritance, we can achieve multiple inheritance. We can say that, but again, this sentence is also problematic. We can talk about that some later sessions, but things are good. Alright then, so multiple inheritance can be achieved in Java by using interface. Cool. So that's what we did. Imagine there is a class called test, which is implementing couple of interfaces called test1 and test2. And this is one interface, this is one interface. Let's say all the features that I have inside this couple of interfaces, this test class will fetch it. Okay, cool. Imagine that test1 is having a variable. Let's say private int, or let's not say private, okay? Let's say int value is equal to 10, okay? Let's say there is a variable here. I can have the same variable right here, okay? Int value, let's say 20, okay? Now the test1 and the test2 is having a variable called value, and the similar variable name is here as well called value, and it has been assigned to some values right here. Cool. Now I'll be asking you a question. The first question is, inside the test class, as it is implementing test1 and test2, these two interfaces, I'll be able to access the value of this. I'll be able to access the value of this variable called value. So how can I access this? For an example, if I want to print sys out, and if I want to access value here, then how can I do it? Obviously, it is giving me a compilation problem, because what I feel a variable called value here, and I can directly access it because the test1 is already implementing the test1 and test2, and this interface's property will be available here inside this test class. But this is giving me a compilation problem. Now the question that you'll be getting in your exam or in your interview is going to be, how can I access that particular variable? Now tell me one thing, guys. Right now, what is the scope of this particular variable called value? This value variable is inside a interface called test1. So does this one. It is inside a interface called test2. Now what is like, is it a private variable or a public variable or a protected variable? What do you think? What is the access modifier for this? And I think most of you guys already know the interface variables are by default public, not private. It's by default public and static like this, whether you write it or you don't write it. So all your interface variables by default public and static like this, right? So whether you write it or if you don't write it, by default they are going to be public and static. Now the thing is that if it is public and static, if the interface variables are exposed as a static variable to the outer world, now this test class, which is implementing the test1 and test2, so if it wants to access the value, let's say right now, if you're just writing value, it will not work. Now we need to specify which value we want to access inside the test class, which value that I want to access. Well, I want to access the variable value of test1 interface. Okay, I want to access the variable value of test2 interface. And in order to specify that, what I can do, how can I access the value? This value is what? Let's say static. Okay, this value is from where? From this test1 interface. Just write it down. Just write it inside this test1 dot value. Okay, like this. Now I am basically trying to access the test1 value over here. Okay, now if I want to access the test2 value from the test class, then how can I do it? It's already extends to test2, so I can just do sys out test2 dot value right there. Okay, and if I do a right click, run as Java application, and here is my values 10 and 20. So I'm able to access the value from test1 and test2 like this using the interface name, because all the interface variables are by default public and static, whether you write it or you don't write it. Okay, I think this is making sense. Now let's talk about methods. Okay, now let's start talking about the methods. Okay, now imagine we have the same class called test, which implements the test1 and test2 interfaces right here. And right now inside the test1 interface, let's say we have a method called public. By default, all the interface methods are abstract. So public abstract. Okay, void, let's say some method name m1. Okay, and if I don't write this, then by default my method will be public and abstract. That's default. If you write it or if you don't write it, all the interface methods are by default public and abstract. Okay, cool. So right now, there we go. We have a m1 method. Imagine I have the exact same method with the exact same signature inside another interface called test2 like this, right? So my test1 and test2 is having the similar method called m1. And now my test class, which is implementing the test1 and test2, is right now giving me a problem. Right now, if I only extend to test1 or test2, either of them, you can see if I'm only implementing test1, I'm still having an error over here, and it is asking me to implement the m1 method. The method need to be overridden over here because obviously test is a class and it is implementing the test1. Test1 is having a method which does not have anybody. So if you want to have the feature of test1 over here, then obviously you have to override the M1. That's the basic thumb rule of the interfaces. I think most of you already know that. So let me implement the unimplemented method of M1. Okay, so I have overridden the M1 method. Now basically let me remove this. Okay, now let me basically implement both of my interface called test1 and test2 all together. Now if I'm gonna be overriding this, then how many methods I'll be overriding? Do I need to override two M1 method? Because right now my test1 and test2 both are interfaces which has been implemented by this test, but I really don't have to do that. If I'll click on this, like implement the unimplemented method, then I only need to give the definition for the M1. So if I'll come to over here and if I'll do sysout, and I have to give the signature for M1, and I have to give like, okay, inside M1 of test, right? This will work fine. And inside my main method, if I want to use this, I can just do new test and let me just call the M1. There we go. Do Control S, right click, run as Java application, and things should work fine inside M1 of test. So it's working good. So, I have the same method in both of my interfaces, but I am overriding it inside the class wherever my my class has been implementing both of these methods, as it is having the same signature. So I just need to override it once and I can just use it right from my class, right? I think this is very simple. Okay, so now we just know like how we can solve the diamond problem, or the multiple inheritance problem that we have in Java using abstract classes or the normal classes. How we can solve it using interfaces. And this is a very good example where a couple of interfaces is having the same method. Now the same method has been overridden by another class called test, which is basically implementing all this couple of interfaces called test1 and test2, which is having the exact same method without a body. And here we have overridden that particular method inside the test class and given it an implementation, and that is the implementation that we are using over here, and the compiler is happy, right? Because we have only one place we have given the implementation for M1 method, and that is inside my class called test, or inside my class I have given the implementation for the abstract method M1. So before we go for a couple more problems, which is related to the multiple inheritances, I just want you guys to, answer me a question, because right now this is really very important for me to bring this particular point. Imagine, let me just delete one of the, interface. Let's say I have only one, interface over here called test1. Let me bring this up a little bit. So can I select this and I'll hit Option, and if you're using Windows you can hit Alt and just bring this up. Okay, I will bring this up to here. Okay, there we go. And right now I have this interface called test1. Now I have a class called test which implements test1, let's say like this. And right now imagine it is overriding the M1 method like this. Okay, very simple, very straightforward. We have a class called test, implements test1. Test1 is having one abstract method called M1. That's what I'm overriding, giving the implementation right here. Looking good. Now imagine I have another class here. Let's say I have another class here called public class test2. Test2 is right now a class, or maybe I can say I can have another class called demo that implements the same interface. My interface name is test1, and there you go. Okay, so now demo is a class which is going to give me the problem because it will ask me to implement the unimplemented method. So I'm going to be add the unimplemented method of test1, and test1 is having a M1 method. I'm going to be doing that. I'll be overriding it, and I'll say, can I copy this system.out.println, Control C, paste it, and inside m1 method of demo class. Okay, this is inside m1 method of test class. So I'm giving a body to my m1 method, and still we are having a problem here because in my demo class I'm writing all this code inside a single source file, which is my test.java, and inside a single source file we should have only one class which is having a public access modifier. So I will be removing public from this, and if you want to remove the public from this also, I think this will work fine. Do a Control-A, Control-Shift-F to format the code. This is how your code looks like. Pretty straightforward design. This is how if you are coding for years, this is very simple for you. That okay, I have an interface, it has a method m1, then couple of classes are there, test and demo. They're implementing the test1 interface, and I'm overriding the method over here of the test1 interface, which is m1, right? Which is pretty simple and pretty straightforward. Cool, things are good. Now imagine your client has given you a task that, okay, I want to add one more method inside this test1 interface. Okay, so how to add that? Obviously, it's going to be pretty simple. You can say, okay, you want to add one more method. What is the method name? Okay, he says, okay, go ahead and add a method called m2. Okay, there you go. I have added a method right here called m2 inside my interface called test1. Now there is a problem here. Now all my classes that I have, it has broken. Why? Because these classes are implementing the test1 interface, and the test1 right now is having another new method, and that method also need to be overridden by all these classes. Now imagine in your project there are thousands classes which is implementing a particular interface, and when you as a developer went into that interface file and added a new method right there, then all of your project classes is broken. And now that is going to be very challenging, and that challenge Java people also realized, and they have introduced a new concept called default method in Java 8. So what they did, they said, okay, if you want to introduce new methods inside an interface, and if that interface has been implemented by so many classes, you don't want to break the code over there. So what you can use a default method. So just simply write default over here, and that's it. And default in public, let me write like all your interface methods are by default public. It is a public and abstract. But if you want to write a default method, then the method will no longer be an abstract method, and you can just give a body to this like this. Okay, and in this case, the moment I change this m2 method to a default method, you can see I have given a fake implementation. There is actually nothing inside this implementation, but all my classes right now, which is basically implementing this test1 interface, which is this one where I have introduced a new method, these classes are right now not breaking. These classes are right now, they are just doing good, right? So that is the beauty of the default method. Default method is there, like if you don't want to break your classes and you have to introduce a new method inside your interface, just use the default method and give it a fake implementation like this. Maybe I can say sysout, default implementation of m2. Okay, so I just have given a default implementation for m2, and all my classes are doing good. Let's say right now one of my class, let's say my test class right now want to use m2 method, then what it needs to do, as it is already implementing this one, it can just override. It can just do a control space, and I can just override the m2 method. You can see I can just tap on this enter, and I can just override the m2 method, and right here I can just give a implementation. Let's say sysout, and I can just say inside m2 method of test class. Okay, there we go. So now let's say test class is not happy about the default implementation and want to use the m2 method of test1 interface. Now this class has overridden the m2 method and given an implementation. Now if you want to use it, now I can just do a main, type enter. Okay, now I have a main method inside the test class. Now I can simply do new test like this dot, and I want to use the M2 method. So I can simply say M2. There you go, do a Control S. And if I run this code right now of test class, run as Java application, and you can see inside M2 method of test class. So now this M2 method is getting called from the test class because I have overridden the M2 right over here. So inside M2 method of test class is getting printed on the console. But let's say if I don't have it, okay, if I don't have it, then what will happen? If I run the same code, here the M2 method I'm calling, so is it present inside the test class? No, it is not present inside the test class. So the test class is happy with the default implementation of M2 because it has not yet overridden it. So the interface, this concrete method that we have written over here using the default keyword will be called. So the interface default method will be called right now, right here. So do right click, run as Java application. If I run this, you can see default implementation of M2 is right now printed inside the console, because whenever I run this particular program of test class, now test class is using M2, but M2 has not been overridden here. So it's using the parent, which is my test, this M2 method, which has been given as a default implementation to my code. Hopefully this is making sense, right? So this is pretty simple. So if I reboot back my code, this is just to show you the changes. If I reboot back my code, if you see this code, you can think like this. Okay, I have a class called test. This implements test1. Okay, fine. Now it has overridden the M2 method. So M2 being a default method in my test1 interface is being overridden right over here. But if you see the demo class, it implements the test1. That means this interface. But the test1 is having a couple of methods, but here it is only overriding one method, okay, which is your M1 method. So M2 method has not been overridden, but not a problem. M2 has given as a default implementation, so you may override it, or if you are happy with the parent implementation, just go for it. Okay, this is your default method concept. All right, so before we wrap up this one last question. Maybe people can ask you in interview and maybe in your exam as well, if you're giving any online test, right? Imagine right now, we have an interface called test1 where we have a default method. For example, this is a class called test which implements the test1. And obviously, right here we have overridden the M2, which is our default method. And M1 also we have overridden, which is the abstract method, and we have given it a body. But for an example, imagine I have a requirement here. For an example, I'll just remove this M2 method, which is my default method, which I was overridden before. I have removed it. Imagine I have a random method right here called public void hello. Okay, so imagine this is some random method that I have over here inside my test class. Now question will be, okay, so if you want to use the default method written by your interface test1 right here, which is M2, inside this hello method of test class, how can we call this one? So how can you call the default method of M2, okay, of test1? Anyhow, your test class is implementing the test1 interface. So don't see this code. It will be this much only. Now tell me how you will be able to access the M2 from a random method like hello inside the test class. And it is going to be very simple. So the way you can access it, first of all, you have to write your interface name like this, test1. Then you have to use a keyword called super, and then you have to do dot, and you have to use the method name, and the method name is M2. So here I'm saying that, well, I want to call the test1 M2 method. So test1 right here, I want to call the M2 method. I'm using the super keyword to call it. That's it. And if you want to call the hello method, you know how to do it. So let me quickly check this if I'm able to call this, and I can say new test. Test is my class dot hello, and whenever I call hello method is this one, is internally is going to call M2, and M2 is my default method in my interface. So let's see if I can do it. So let me run my test class. So my test class is having the main method. So if I do run this, right click, run as run as Java application, and you can see I'm able to call the default method of M2. I'm calling the hello method right here. Hello method is calling the M2 method right here. And this is the line which is getting printed on my console. Okay, one last questions that you can get in your exam is going to be like this. For an example, you have a default method called M2 inside a test1. Now inside the test class, okay, the method where you are calling this M2 method using the super keyword, and you are referring the test1, and test1 is basically your interface that you're implementing right over here and calling the M2 method. What about this hello is a static method. So if I'll write public static, then what will happen? So as you can see, the right away, we are having a problem here. And as soon as I made this hello method static, the super keyword stopped working, because super is going to be worked for the instance objects, right? And you can see cannot use super in a static context. And obviously hello is a static method, and inside a static context, the super keyword does not work because it's meant for the instance stuff. So how to call M2 method, which is my default method right now. If I click over here, how to call this method if I want to use it on a static method inside a class. And in order to do that, for an example, here I'll come to my test class, and here if I have a static method, then I have to create an object for the test class, and using the object reference, I have to make a call to the M2 method like as usual. So you can just do test t is equal to new test, and mind you, like test is my class name, and I can just do t dot m2, and like this you can make a call, and you can call the hello method right here inside the public static void main of the test class. And obviously you don't have to create an object of the test class in order to call this hello method right now, because it is static. So what you can do, you can just instead of creating an object like this, you can just directly call the hello method, and it is not going to give you any problem because it is a static method. And now if I'll run this, run as Java application, you can see default method of M2 is just got printed over here. So things are working like a charm. So this is all about how to use the super keyword and how to use the object reference to call the default method inside another method inside a class, which is basically implementing your interface. Okay, hopefully this is making sense. Before I go for the last concept about the multiple inheritance problems, one thing I want to show you, like some people ask in the interview, this default, is it something related to the access modifier that you have? If you know, you have a lot of access modifier like public, protected, default is also an access modifier. So default is the same keyword which is related to your access modifier? Absolutely not. This default is used inside an interface whenever you are writing any concrete method inside an interface that has to be preceded by the keyword called default, and it has nothing to do with the access modifier. Okay, and sometimes also people ask, like, can I write public default? Will it work? And absolutely, this will also work. Public default or default public, they all are same thing. So any reverse order is possible, and they will not give you any compilation error whenever you're writing a default method inside an interface. I think this is also clear. So now let's go to the last and the very interesting part of this particular session. As you might see, my webcam or my face cam disappeared just because there is a power failure right now in my studio and I am not able to record my face. I think that is fine because you don't give a damn seeing me, obviously. So what you care about is the code. So let's continue making this video without the face cam. And right now, let's start learning about the final thing about the multiple inheritance problems that we have in Java, and we will discuss about the problem which might occur after the Java 8 changes, because you know about after Java 8 we got introduced this default method, okay, and how default method basically impact the multiple inheritance issue. Let's talk about that right now a little bit. Okay, let's refactor our code a little bit. So now let's say we have an interface called test1. Let me copy the same interface and let me create another interface right here called test2. Okay, let me change the interface name to test2. Imagine it has one default method called m2. Look at that, you have a m2 method which is a default method inside the test1 interface, and default implementation of m2 of test1. Well, let me be very specific, and also I'll copy this line and I'll paste it over here, and let me say default implementation of m2 of test2 interface. Right now I have a same default method with the same signature and method name in both of my interfaces. Now let's talk about a problem which might occur. Now imagine if there is a class called test. Let me just remove all the other stuff like this. Now I have a class called test. Let me remove all these methods, and imagine let me remove the main method as well. Now I have test class, and I want to achieve multiple inheritance by implementing couple of interfaces. So I'll say test1 comma test2, right? So now I have couple of interfaces and I'm implementing it to my class test, and now I have to override all the methods, right? This m1 method also, let me just remove it. I don't need it inside the test interface. So my test interface, test1 interface and my test2 interface both is having only one default method called m2, but the only thing is that it has the same method signature in both of my interfaces. You can see now I am having a problem. Now the class, this class test is forcing me to override the test, the m2 method. You can see override default method in test1, override the default method in test2. So it is saying that you need to override this default method right here inside the test class, because the test1 is having the m2 method and the test2 is also having the m2 method. So inside the test class you have to override either this method or this method. That means you have to give a body for the m2 method right here. But if you remove one of the default method, if you comment this out, I think it'll not complain. See, the error is gone right now. It is not complaining because obviously right now the test class is getting the features of test1 and test2, is borrowing the methods from test1 and test2, and test1 is having the default method. It does not need to be overridden by the class, which is basically implementing the test1 interface right here, which has the m2 because it has the body. There is no need to override it over here. But for test2 there is no method, so it is also not complaining about it. But the moment I just have the similar m2 method with the similar signature inside the test2 interface, it is just raising a problem and is saying that you got to override that, because obviously the compiler is confused right now. If I'll do main method and if I'll start, if I want to call the default method, then obviously how can I call the default method right here? Let's say if I want to call, let's say if I'll do test t is equal to new test, and right now test is my class name, and if I'll do the same, and now if I'll do t dot m2, then obviously right now there will be a problem, right? It is going to be confused which m2 to call, because the test, which is my class, is implementing both of these interfaces, and both of these interfaces is having a default method. So it is confused whether to call the m2 method of test2 or whether to call the m2 method of test1. So what we got to do is we got to override this the m2 method. Okay, and right here I don't want to call using super. I can either call like this. Let's say inside this m2 method that I'm overriding inside my test class right here, I'm overriding the m2 method which is a default method, and here I'm calling my m2 method of test1. So test1, this m2 method I'm calling right here, which is going to give and print this line to my console, right? So inside my test class I'm calling m2. So if I'll do run as Java application, it is going to give me default implementation of M2 of test1 because I'm calling the test1 M2 method. I can call the test2 M2 method right here. And obviously here I'm making a call to M2, which is this one. So obviously right now test2 M2 method, which is this one, will be called. And it is going to print M2 of test2, right? So if I'm going to do right click, run as Java application, it is going to say default implementation of M2 of test2. And if you don't want to call either test1 or test2 M2 method, rather test class itself want to give its own implementation, then you can just write this out and just write inside M2 method of test class. Okay, now this is the class and I can call it over here and do right click, run as Java application, and it will work as well inside M2 method of test class. So you know right now how to call the default method of this class or this class using the super keyword, or you also know right now how to override the default method of any of the interfaces. Maybe if the default method will be there in all these interfaces, then it might ask us to override the method, and this is how you're going to be doing it. Okay, and I think this is clear, and there are lot of questions been asked in an interview which is going to be pretty similar like this. One last thing before I wrap up, maybe one type of tricky question they can ask. For an example, guys, right now let me just remove everything from this test class. Let me just remove the M2 method. Okay, now imagine what I'm gonna do. I have a test interface which has a default method called M2. Now let's say I have a test2, but let's say this is a class. Okay, and the class will not have the default method, so obviously it will have a concrete method. So let me just remove the default, because default will only work for the interface. And now you have an M2 method of test2 class. This is test2. Test2 is a class right now, and this test1 is an interface. So M2 method of test1 interface. Okay, so now the question is, now if you go to the test class, now the test class is basically right now need to have the feature of test2 and test1. Test2 is a class, so let me say test extends test2, okay, and implements test1. Okay, test1 is basically an interface, test2 is a class, and the test class extends to the test2 class, which is this class, and this implements the test1. Now tell me guys, right now you can see it is not giving me any problem. The test2 is also having a method with M2 with the same signature called public and void, and the test1 is also having a method called M2 with the same signature public and void, but this is an interface method and it is given as default. Right now you can see in the class test, whenever you're extending to the test2 and implementing the test1, you're trying to borrow the feature of both from the test2 and test1, it is not complaining and not forcing you to override the M2 method. And right now if you're going to do test, which is my class name, test t is equal to new test, and right now if I'm going to do t.m2, now what do you think? Which method will be called? Whether this method of the class test2 will be called, or this method, which is the same M2 method here we have of the interface, is going to be get called. And absolutely the answer is pretty simple. Whenever you have a default method inside the interface and you have an exact same method which is not a default method inside a class with the same signature, then the class method will take the priority. And right over here, if you're going to do run as Java application, then you can see default method of M2 of test2 class got called. Now this method got called, but if you're going to comment this out, obviously we don't have any other M2 method, so this is going to take the priority. So now if you're going to do right click, run as Java application, then the M2 of test1 interface got called. But if you're gonna have another interface like this, Control C and paste it over here. And if I'm gonna say test3, and this is the interface which is having the same M2 method, then M2 of test3 interface. Now you have two interface which has the same M2 method. Now if your class extends to test2 and implements test1 interface and test3 interface, now you have a problem again, because now test1 and test3 is right now going to have the same M2 method. So you got to override it inside the class that is basically implementing both of this interface. So it is saying you want to override the default method of test1 or test3, or you want to give your own implementation. So if you are just clicking on one of this thing, it is right now overriding, it is right now calling the M2 method of test1, or you can just call the M2 method of test2, or you can just give your own implementation, sysout, blah blah blah, something right over here. Okay, I hope this is making sense and you understand the priority between the default method and the method with the same signature inside a class. I hope this makes sense, and I hope you understand different scenario that we have covered using the multiple inheritance. We'll resume again and we will talk about a brand new concept in the next session. Until then, have a good day. Do the hands-on. Take care. Bye-bye. And don't forget to code this out. Happy coding. Bye-bye.